guys, welcome back to my channel and to a new video. We are going to try something a little different this week. I recorded, well, here, let me take a step back. You all know that I've been doing this project where I am reapproaching some paintings that I did a number of years ago, and I've been calling it the Then and Now project, and I'm posting it mostly on Instagram. I'll post like side by sides of the original painting and then what I have done now, just as a way to kind of revisit old work and see where things have changed and where I've grown and where I could still grow. So this painting that you see me working on right now is part of that series. And if you can't tell yet, it's a lemon. And I basically was redoing a painting that was very similar, just a single lemon from the same perspective. I'll have it up here on the screen somewhere. And I wanted to do it at roughly the same size as well. So you can see that I'm working fairly large. And I'm going to give a little bit of the climax of the video away. Spoiler alert here, that this painting that you see me working on right now is actually going to end up getting totally destroyed by me. And I worked on it quite a while and then ended up ruining it and decided to then retry again. You guys are going to see this process of me working through the first reattempt at the painting. And then I'm going to talk about what went wrong and why I think it went wrong. And then what I did in my third attempt, my third approach, my now 2.0. So, hope that sounds interesting. I have had a lot of questions over the years from folks wanting to know like how to tell when a painting is ruined or how to tell when it's time to start over. And so hopefully we'll be able to get into some of that today. And it will be helpful for you. All right, so I'm just going to kind of briefly describe. I'm not going to show the whole process here because, as I said, this is the painting that ends up getting scrapped. As you can tell, I'm starting out with a watercolor. This is my hydrous watercolor. And I have done some wet on wet techniques to kind of try to get a really smooth application of the watercolor. I'm using mostly lemon yellow, or actually, what is it called? What does the hydrous range call it? Hansa Yellow Light. So that is mostly what I'm using. I think I may have a teeny tiny drop of cadmium in here. Cadmium yellow, but it's at least 90% of the Hansa Yellow Light, and I'm using a pretty big brush, keeping things really wet. And then I'm going to add on some, I think it was like mostly purple with a little bit of ultramarine. I don't honestly remember what the mix was, but my thought was that I wanted to create some dimension with the watercolor, which is what I usually do. And wanted to have that really soft, smooth gradient. So I worked with wet on wet, and I was actually really happy with how things are moving along at this point. It was looking more or less how I wanted to, and I really liked the kind of painterly look. So I decided to just step back and let it dry, and then would continue to add detail with colored pencil. So I picked a pretty simple color palette. I've got canary yellow and white and deco yellow. And then I think it's either 10 or 20% cool gray. And then this color called gray lavender, I think. So pretty straightforward palette. And then I was just doing my usual approach, kind of looking closely at the reference image and working my way across, creating detail. Rather than covering the entire thing with colored pencil, I felt like I had a good base layer of color down. So I was just mostly looking to add the details with the colored pencil. And overall, I was pretty happy with this part of the process. I felt like things were coming along nicely. I will say, looking back and thinking back as I was doing this, I got to a point, and this will always happen, but I got to a point where I had built a pattern in my head. So I was thinking, okay, all of these little circles, all of these little divots in the lemon, I'm going to make them as circles. And I had a kind of rough idea of how far I wanted to have them spaced and what size I wanted them to be. And so I wasn't looking all that much at the reference image. I did feel like I was really focusing on color and trying to get the color right, which was a good thing. But I kind of broke from the reference image, I think, a little sooner than I should have. And I don't know if that's what caused the issues with the piece, or yeah, the really bad stuff is going to happen later on. You'll see. Right now, I was still more or less happy with it. So just kind of working my way across, building up that detail. And then eventually got to a point where I decided to add some Sharpie paint pen. And I did this in this situation, as I usually do, because I wanted to have some more opaque highlights, some brighter white highlights. So I just kind of worked my way across, adding some of those. And at this point here, I was feeling like it was pretty much done. Although now that I'm looking at the video footage, it looks really flat to me. So I'm not surprised that I ended up having trouble with it. But I stopped at this point and scanned it in. And here you can see the scan. And once I saw the scan, I could tell that there were really some serious issues, not only with the color, but with the form. Actually, probably more so with the color than with the form. I felt like it was way too cold, and it was kind of dead looking, and you also really couldn't see a lot of the texture that I had spent so long adding. And some of this was because of the scan. Yellow is, or in my experience, something that is entirely yellow is a challenging color to have the color translate accurately, and then also to have the color show kind of form and dimension and detail. So I spent a little while trying to tweak it, and felt like it just wasn't getting where I wanted to. And I came to the conclusion that that little area, the kind of shadow area at the bottom, was just too dark, and that there wasn't enough contrast between like the little tiny, if you look really close, there's like the little tiny spots, the divots in the lemon. And I felt like the areas that were not in the divots should have been a bit lighter. So I decided, well, at that point I realized I had kind of a choice between I could either try to fix it digitally, or I could try to fix it traditionally. And I knew that I had done what I could do for the most part with colored pencil, unless I went outside and sprayed it with a fixative, and I didn't really feel like spraying it with a fixative. So I decided to try to fix it with gouache. And unfortunately, I stopped recording at that point. And I don't know why I stopped recording. Maybe I just could tell that things were going to go downhill. I think I was already a little bit frustrated with the piece. But I have the finished result, and I'm going to show it to you guys. So here it is. And I guess it doesn't look all that bad when it's on film here, but there definitely are some significant issues with it. Overall, I feel like just the color looks really off, and that's always kind of tough to translate on film, but you'll have to take my word for it that the color just it doesn't look good. It looks really kind of grayed and muddy and overworked and self-conscious, and it just has a very heavy feel to it. And then the other problem was that I, throughout the process of working with the gouache, I pretty much threw the reference out the window. I would look at it occasionally, but I really developed a very kind of formulaic application, which is okay for certain styles, but it tends to end up looking too symmetrical or too regular, and some of the things that are really irregular and interesting in nature get lost. So yeah, this whole area in here, I just felt like the texture it didn't look right. And it looked too much like a repeating pattern as opposed to something that you would actually see in nature. And yeah, if you watch my channel, if you've heard me talk about this before, you know my opinion on throwing things out and starting over again. I don't do it very often. I almost always will try to push through and try to fix a piece. And that's part of the reason that I really like working with mixed media, is it gives you a lot of different options for doing that. But since I more or less got the entire surface area of this covered with gouache, really the only option I would have for continuing to work with it was to add more gouache or some other kind of acrylic-based paint. Gouache is just not my strong suit, and since color already was tricky for me, I felt like I need to go back to square one. Basically, I need to do this over again. So I started over again. And I decided to work at like half the size, a little bit less than half the size, mostly because I was kind of exasperated at how much time I had already invested into it. But I have that whole process recorded as well. So I can say goodbye to my face for now, and we're going to talk, I'll talk you through the process of what I did in the next iteration of the painting and how I approach things differently and how I feel things turned out. So see you in a minute. Okay, so here we go again, lemon part 3. And you can't really tell, I guess. Well, you can tell when you see my hands, but this piece is, as I said, about half the size of the other one. So I'm taking a similar approach in that I'm starting with the Hydrous watercolor once again, but I'm just keeping it a lot simpler this time since I felt like maybe some of what contributed to that muddiness was having gone too dark and too desaturated too early in the process with some of those initial shadows. So whereas last time I was working really wet on wet, this time I'm just kind of working my way across the piece, wet on dry. I'm not worrying too much about the smoothness since I'm not going to do any gradients or anything like that. And the other thing that's different this time is that I have gone a bit warmer with the yellow. So it still is mostly the Hansa yellow light, but it's probably like 9 parts Hansa yellow light to 1 part cadmium. And the last time in the initial attempt, I just had like maybe, I don't even know what the percentage would be, but it was the tiniest touch of cadmium and was almost all Hansa yellow light. So this time I'm also using a slightly smaller brush, which is mostly to do with the size of the painting itself. So just working my way over the whole surface, trying to get a nice, relatively even color of a yellow that's pretty cool, but does have a tiny bit of warmth to it since I don't want it to feel, dead and lifeless like the last one did. So I let that dry and decided to use a relatively similar color palette. I'm showing several different colors here, but honestly, I ended up just using mostly the same ones, the canary yellow, the white, the 10% gray. Actually, I don't even think I used the 10% gray. Canary yellow, the white, the grayed lavender. And then the one that I used this time that was different is this one called, it's either bronze or artichoke. I also started with the white a little bit earlier this time because I wanted to get clear on where some of those highlights were. And I paid way closer attention to the reference image. So I actually even put like a little visual grid over the reference image using my iPad. And that was just to help me kind of get a sense for the scale of some of these shapes. And I really tried to pull myself away from the kind of formula that I had in my brain. And, if you think of a lemon or any piece of citrus fruit, my guess is you think of the same thing that I do, which is that has like all of these little dimples all over the surface. And it's easy to just have those come across like polka dots, but they are actually quite irregular and a lot of them connect. And if you're really looking at a reference, really looking at a real piece of citrus fruit, you can see that there's a lot more dimension. It's not just these little super even polka dots. So I tried to really focus on that and to keep very close connection with the reference image so that I didn't end up getting too formulaic. And in terms of the overall color, as I said, I'm using more or less the same color palette with the pencils that I did the first time around. But a thing that I did differently in this image, in this painting, and you can see I'm putting a lot of the canary yellow down in some of the shadow area. And that's because in the first attempt, I felt like that shadow area just got too too desaturated. I don't know if it was too dark, but it was too desaturated. It looked too kind of cool and muddy. So I wanted to keep this a bit warmer, and I'm doing just kind of like a little bit of a glaze of the canary yellow to help make that happen. So then on top of the glaze of canary yellow, I am going really, really soft and light with the gray lavender, and I'm basically creating the shadow that I had created on the first piece, partially with watercolor. I'm doing that now with colored pencil, and I have a lot more control with colored pencil just because of the way I use it. I could have used watercolor in a really refined way as well, but you know me, that's not really my thing with watercolor. So I have decided to use the gray lavender just as a way to kind of mute the intensity of the yellow. You can see it's still a really, really light color. So it's not going to be all that much darker, but just the difference in saturation level and a slight difference in darkness is going to give a sense that the lemon is kind of curving backwards. So I'm still paying very close attention to the reference image here. I'm trying to really make sure I don't go too dark or don't get the shadows in places where there shouldn't be shadows, and just really taking my time, going really, really softly to build up that darker area of value. And then in addition to using the gray lavender for the shadow, I'm also using it to make the little shapes of the divots. And I already mentioned this, but I am trying this time really hard not to get too formulaic with the little divots. I'm trying to kind of cluster them together in some areas and give more of a sense of like organic realism as opposed to just a repeating pattern. So I'm just continuing to work my way across the lemon, building up more and more of those little divots, burnishing when I need to with the canary yellow, and creating more of a realistic texture on the surface of the lemon. And this whole time, I'm really trying to use the reference image as my guide. I'm looking at it constantly, paying much closer attention to it than I was at this phase with the previous piece. I'm also really happy at this point that I tried the smaller size. It's just easier for me to work my way across in the amount of detail that I want to when it's a little bit of a smaller size. And this thing is still like, 5 times the size of a real lemon. So I have plenty of room to get in all the detail that I want. I also should probably mention that, it crossed my mind, the reference image that I'm using is not ideal, and there are some problems with it. And one of the problems with it is that it doesn't have a really strong sense of form. Some of the light, the sources of light are relatively soft. And because of that, it doesn't really give enough information to go off of. So when I decided to reattempt this, I did consider actually switching reference images, and that might have been a good thing to do. But I was determined to make this work and determined to learn from what I had done on the previous piece. So I decided to go ahead and use the same reference image. But at this point, I have decided to make some slightly different color choices than I did on the first round. So you'll see me here using a slightly warmer yellow. I think it is the Spanish orange from Prismacolor, and I'm just adding a tiny bit of warmth to a few areas of the lemon. And then I also decided that I wanted to add some green to the stem side of the lemon. You can't see it really, really strong in the reference image, but it is there a little bit. And I just felt like, I wanted to have that. I wanted to have that in this image and kind of amplify that to add some visual interest. And then at this point, I am adding some stronger shadows. I'm using that color, the bronze color, and just adding in some they look really dark here because everything else is very light in terms of value, but I'm actually going very, very softly with this line, just trying to describe the edge of the lemon and create more a sense of dimension. And then just going back in with some other colors, with some white, with some green, once again with the gray lavender to try to soften that shadow and make it feel more like a curve and less like a line. And that's really the name of the game in this entire piece, is just gradually building things up, all while looking at the reference image and trying not to to rely too much on the formula that I have in my head. So at this point, I'm feeling pretty happy with how the piece is turning out. I think it's moving in the right direction. I'm much happier with the color than I was with the first one. I'm happier with how things look more organic and less symmetrical and formulaic. There are a few little places where I got kind of messy outside of the body of the lemon, and I'm deciding to just go ahead and clean those up with some opaque white media. In this case, I'm using the Copic opaque white. It's my second favorite. My first favorite is the Dr. P.H. Martin's bleed proof white, but that one dried out for me. And that's the really only big negative I have with that one, is that it does dry out pretty quick. But I still have nearly a full jar of the Copic opaque white, so I'm just using that to clean up some of the edges. And I'm hesitant to do this since I feel like this was part of what sent the last piece on down the wrong path, but I've decided to go ahead and take the risk anyway and use a little bit of Sharpie paint pen. If you're really soft with the Sharpie, you can get quite a tiny little dot, and that was what I was going for in this case. I didn't want to have any, like I actually went pretty heavy, pretty thick with the Sharpie paint pen on the last iteration, and I did not want to do that again. I wanted to mostly stick to little tiny dots. So you'll see that is pretty much what I'm doing across the whole surface of the piece, where, well, not the whole surface of the piece, but wherever things are really light. And there are even a few places, if I'm looking closely at the reference image, where there are these really small little white dots. And so I'm kind of adding some of those to the shadow areas as well, being really careful, again, not to get too formulaic, not to just go over the whole surface of the painting with little dots, but to try to follow the anatomy of the subject to really help describe it in a realistic way. All right, so that is the painting done, and it's the third attempt. At this point, I have to go ahead and scan it, and I'm going to show you guys the scan right now. Okay, so here's the scan, and I think you'll agree that if you look at it side by side or one right after another with the other scan, it definitely is an improvement, but honestly, I'm still just not really happy with how the scan turned out, and I did a bit of color tweaking with this one. Here is the original lemon painting from, I think, 2013, and then here is my second attempt, and what I ended up doing to it with the gouache. And then finally, here is the third attempt. So there's the then and the now and the now and the final now. So yeah, overall, the biggest takeaway with this for me was that doing a subject that is entirely a light value with very little value variation is really challenging. And yellow itself makes the color kind of trickier, but I think it more has to do with the fact that it's all in this really light value. And that was something I knew already, but it was just kind of the point was driven home. And then the other thing was that I really needed to pay very, very close attention to the details if I wanted it to look realistic and not formulaic. Overall, I'm really happy that I reattempted it, and that I didn't give up. I'm proud of myself for that because I was pretty frustrated with this piece. So yeah, I think that's about what I have to say about the process. So if you guys have other specific questions about knowing when it's time to give up on a piece, or how, maybe your own experience, how you know when it's time to give up and start over, please do leave those in the comments. As I said, it's not something that's really common for me, but I don't necessarily think that's a good thing. I think that there are plenty of times that I have really pushed through and worked to get a painting to where I wanted it to be. But honestly, probably if I had started from the beginning, it would have been quicker. So that's it. I'll put your questions about that or really anything else in the comments. And please do leave a comment. It really helps the videos find their way up in the rankings. Thank you to everybody who does. It means so much. And I read all of your comments and I'm grateful for each of them. And thank you for subscribing. If you don't subscribe, please do. And of course, thank you to my patrons who made this video possible. This video, as with every video on my channel, is sponsored by my patrons who make it possible for me to have a video editor, which makes it possible for me to put weekly videos out for you guys, even though I am a full-time freelancer. So that is it. Hope everybody has a great week, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.